North Atlantic, the 17th of March, 1942. The wind doesn't just blow out here. It screams, tearing through the rusted rigging of a British merchant ship like skeletal fingers clawing at metal, slicing through fog so dense you could choke on it. The air tastes like salt and fear, and somewhere below invisible patient the ocean's most terrifying predators are circling. German U-boats. That single month, just 31 days, 275 Allied ships would vanish beneath these black waters. Most of them never saw it coming. One moment, sailors joking over thin coffee in the mess hall. The next, a torpedo's whistle. A flash of white fire. Then nothing but the Atlantic's cold, suffocating embrace. The Allies weren't just losing ships, they were bleeding out. Every convoy that left port was a roll of the dice with death. Britain was starving. America's supplies weren't getting through. And with every hole that slipped beneath the waves, hope sank a little deeper. But then, in the absolute heart of this chaos, salvation appeared from the most impossible place imaginable. Not from a laboratory. Not from military high command. Not from some decorated admiral with a wall full of medals. From a cook's galley. A man whose weapon wasn't a depth charge or a torpedo, but lard, tinfoil, and an eye that saw patterns where others saw only shadows. His name? You've never heard of him. History almost forgot him entirely. But what this cook invented? Stirring soup in a cramped kitchen while enemy submarines stalked just beneath the hull would deceive Nazi sonar operators, baffle periscope commanders, and ultimately save thousands of lives. It sounds completely absurd, like something from a fever dream. And yet against every rational expectation, against all military logic, it worked. What you're about to hear isn't Hollywood fiction. This isn't one of those too good to be true internet myths that falls apart under scrutiny. Every detail that follows comes from declassified naval records, buried for decades in restricted military archives, only surfacing when a curious historian stumbled across a strange footnote about optical deflection tactics developed in merchant vessels. This actually happened, and the deeper we dive into this story, the more impossible, the more brilliant, the more absolutely mind-bending it becomes. Because this cook's idea didn't just help a few ships slip past submarines. It fundamentally changed how naval warfare thinks about concealment, about deception, about the very nature of hiding in plain sight. But to understand why his solution was so revolutionary, you first need to grasp exactly what nightmare he was up against. During World War II, the German U-boat wasn't just another weapon system. It was industrial-scale terror given a steel hull and a periscope. U-boat, undersea boat, undersea boat. But that clinical name doesn't capture the dread these machines inspired. Allied sailors had darker names for them. Steel coffins, grey wolves, the Reaper's shadow. These weren't clumsy submersibles from the previous war. These were sleek, fast, nearly silent killers equipped with technology that gave them an almost supernatural advantage. Advanced hydrophones could detect a convoy's propeller signature from 10 miles away. Precision periscopes delivered crystal-clear visual identification. And their torpedoes, those could obliterate a cargo ship in seconds. But the truly terrifying thing, they hunted in packs. Wolf-pack tactics. Dozens of submarines coordinating across hundreds of miles of ocean, waiting like predators at a watering hole, then striking simultaneously under cover of darkness. A slow-moving convoy of merchant ships, poorly armed and desperately overloaded with supplies. They didn't stand a chance. The convoys were predictable. Their routes largely fixed, their speed agonizingly slow, their defenses almost laughable. A few destroyer escorts with depth charges that rarely hit anything. Evasive zigzag patterns that did more to delay arrival than prevent attacks. And at night, especially under a bright moon, these ships became floating targets painted in silver light. By the middle of 1941, Britain faced an existential crisis. Food from America, oil from Canada, ammunition, medicine, replacement parts for factories. None of it was arriving in sufficient quantities. The island nation was slowly being strangled. Winston Churchill, a man not easily frightened, later admitted something chilling in his memoirs. The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. Naval strategists threw everything they had at the problem. Depth charges, active sonar pinging, more escort destroyers, increasingly complex zigzag patterns, blackout protocols so strict that sailors couldn't even light a cigarette on deck. But the losses continued. Hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of sailors, millions of tons of desperately needed supplies, all settling onto the ocean floor. Even when they scored victories, even when destroyers managed to sink a U-boat or force one to surface, it was almost always too late. Once a periscope operator locked onto a ship's silhouette, once those distinctive lines were identified, the torpedo was already in the water. The game was rigged, and the Allies were losing badly. Then aboard one particular British merchant vessel, the SS Empire Belle, something unexpected began to unfold. James Crumb wasn't supposed to be anyone special. He wasn't an officer plotting courses on navigation charts. He wasn't an engineer maintaining temperamental engines. He hadn't attended prestigious military academies or studied advanced physics. James Crumb was an assistant cook. His rank? About as low as you could get and still be considered crew. He'd grown up in Yorkshire, a working-class kid from a working-class family in a town where your options were fishing, factory work, or starving. He'd spent most of his life with his hands in dishwater, cooking for fishermen pulling cold nets at dawn, serving stew to dock workers who smelled like coal dust and sweat. When war broke out, Crumb didn't join up out of some burning patriotic fervor. He joined because a merchant ship paid better than the pub kitchen where he'd been scraping by. Simple as that. Survival economics. His job aboard the SS Empire Belle? Prep meals for a crew that rarely tasted anything hot, scrub pots that never seemed to get clean, chop vegetables in a galley that pitched and rolled with every wave, and tried desperately not to think about the fact that a German torpedo could send him to the bottom of the Atlantic before he even heard it coming. But James had one unusual trait, something that made him different from every other cook sailing those deadly waters. He was obsessed with light. Before the war, he worked briefly as a stagehand at a small theatre in Hull. Nothing glamorous, just moving props and adjusting lanterns for amateur productions that barely filled half the seats. But in that cramped theatre, James learned something fascinating. He learned that light, the way it hits surfaces, the way it bends and reflects and creates shadows, could completely transform what the human eye perceives. A clever spotlight could make an actor's face look sinister or angelic. Strategic shadows could make a cheap wooden prop appear like solid stone. And fog machines combined with colored gels, they could make entire sections of the stage simply disappear, swallowed by misdirection and atmosphere. Light didn't just illuminate, light could deceive. So when James found himself on the night shift standing on the upper deck of a merchant ship creeping through waters known to be crawling with U-boats, he started noticing things that others dismissed as meaningless. One moonless night, the convoy barely moving, every man aboard holding his breath and praying to stay invisible. James noticed something odd on the deck plating. Grease stains, just random smears from maintenance work. Kitchen waste that had splashed and dried in irregular patterns. But in the faint ambient light, these stains shimmered. They caught and scattered what little illumination existed, breaking up the clean, hard lines of the ship's structure, making edges look softer, distorted, almost ghost-like. And James thought, what if that's not just an accident? What if that's a solution? The next morning, James Crumb did something that should have gotten him laughed out of the ship's command structure. He approached the chief mate, a grizzled career sailor who'd survived 3 convoy runs and had exactly 0 patience for nonsense, and proposed an idea so ridiculous it sounded like a joke. What if instead of trying to make the ship completely invisible, which was impossible, they tried to make it confusing? Not disappearance, misdirection. His plan? Use reflective cooking foil and whale oil to create deliberate light distortions across the ship's upper structures. Paint certain surfaces with a semi-gloss mixture made from lard and ash. Attach crushed pie tins and irregular bits of foil around the smokestack and bridge, all positioned at strange angles. The goal wasn't stealth, it was visual chaos. Make the ship shimmer. Make it look warped, bent, like something seen through heat haze on a summer road. Create a silhouette that wouldn't match the clean, predictable profiles that U-boat commanders had memorized from their identification manuals. If a periscope operator surfaced expecting to see a standard Allied freighter, but instead saw something that looked wrong, something that didn't quite make sense, maybe, just maybe, they'd hesitate, doubt their identification, surface for a second look, giving escorts time to detect them, or best case scenario, they'd dismiss it entirely as a decoy or optical illusion, not worth the torpedo. The chief mate stared at him like he'd suggested painting the ship bright pink and ringing bells. One officer reportedly called it lunatic theater nonsense from a man who should stick to peeling potatoes. But James persisted. Quietly, patiently, he showed them the grease patterns, explained the physics of light diffusion in his clumsy, unprofessional way, drew crude diagrams on the back of mess hall menus, and then, whether out of desperation, curiosity, or simply having nothing left to lose, the captain gave him permission. Just a test. Small scale. The bridge area only. If it did nothing, fine. They'd scrub it off and never speak of it again. But if it worked, that evening as the convoy prepared to pass through one of the most dangerous stretches of the North Atlantic, the Iceland Gap, a corridor where U-boat wolf packs gathered like sharks at a feeding frenzy, James Crumb put his absurd theory to the test. Working quickly in the fading light, he and a few volunteers coated sections of the bridge with his homemade semi-gloss mixture, lard, ash, a bit of engine grease for viscosity. Then they attached irregular pieces of crushed tinfoil at odd angles, some catching light directly, others reflecting it as strange vectors. When night fell and the moon emerged from cloud cover, the result was unsettling. The treated section of the ship didn't look invisible. It looked wrong. It shimmered in ways that solid metal shouldn't shimmer. Edges appeared to bend. The hard industrial lines of the bridge seemed to melt and reform, like looking at something through broken glass or underwater or in the grip of a fever dream. Several crewmen reported feeling genuinely disturbed by it. It made their eyes hurt to focus on, made their brains struggle to process what they were seeing. Looks like the ship's melting. One sailor muttered. Looks haunted, said another. Perfect. The convoy crept forward through the darkness, every man aboard knowing that somewhere beneath them, steel tubes filled with men and torpedoes were hunting, listening, watching through periscopes that could spot a silhouette from miles away. Hours passed, agonizing, silent except for the wind and waves. Then morning, grey dawn breaking across cold water, and they were still afloat. All of them. Not a single ship hit. But here's where it gets interesting. The next day, intelligence from the Admiralty decoded intercepts from German naval communications revealed something extraordinary. A U-boat commander in that exact area at that exact time had surfaced briefly to identify the convoy. His transmission mentioned visual confusion, suspected decoys, questioned whether what he was seeing through his periscope was actually real ships or some kind of elaborate trick. He'd had a clear shot, perfect position, calm seas, and he'd done nothing. Submerged, moved on to find more certain targets. Coincidence? Maybe. The skeptics certainly thought so. But the captain of the SS Empire Belle made a decision that would ripple through naval history. He authorized James Crumb to expand the technique immediately. Full ship coverage. Over the following months, as the SS Empire Belle completed voyage after dangerous voyage, James Crumb refined his method into something approaching a science. He experimented with different mixtures, soot patterns that created false shadows, making the ship appear smaller or farther away than it actually was, tinfoil arrangements that caught moonlight and scattered it in unpredictable directions, strategic placement on different hull sections to maximize distortion while maintaining the ship's operational efficiency. The result was a kind of low-fidelity optical camouflage, not unlike the famous dazzle camouflage painted on WWI warships but designed specifically for nighttime observation through submarine periscopes. And here's the crucial insight that made it work. U-boat commanders didn't have unlimited time to identify targets. They operated under immense pressure. Surfacing meant exposure to patrol aircraft and escort destroyers. Every second at periscope depth was a risk, so they relied on split-second visual identification matching silhouettes to memorized profiles calculating speed and distance almost instantly. Crumb's technique attacked that process directly. A distorted silhouette created cognitive friction. The human brain, when presented with something that looks almost right but somehow wrong, has to pause, question, process, and that hesitation, even if it only lasted seconds, could mean the difference between life and death. Add to that the practical complications for torpedo targeting. Many German torpedoes used gyroscopic systems that required accurate estimates of target length, bearing, and speed. If the ship's silhouette was warped, if its edges appeared to shimmer and shift, those calculations became unreliable. Fire based on bad data. The torpedo might pass harmlessly astern or miss entirely, waste a weapon that couldn't be replaced until returning to port. So why risk it? Why not move on to the next convoy, where the targets looked normal, predictable, certain? By late 1942, 4 ships in Crumb's regular convoy had adopted what the crews jokingly called ghost grease or shimmer protocol, and the statistics, though never officially acknowledged, told a remarkable story. Those 4 ships sailed through confirmed U-boat hunting grounds repeatedly. Other vessels on either side of them in the convoy formation, ships just hundreds of yards away, were torpedoed and sunk. But the ghost grease ships? Untouched. Word spread through the merchant marine network. Quietly, unofficially, ships started experimenting with their own variations. Some worked better than others. Not every hull configuration allowed for effective light distortion. Weather conditions mattered enormously, but enough ships survived. Enough near misses were reported that Royal Navy engineers took notice. They documented the technique under the formal classification. Field distortion pattern, improvised. James Crumb's name never appeared in the official documentation, just the ship designation and a technical description of the optical principles involved. But sailors knew, and they kept using it, because when you're sailing through waters where death can arrive without warning, where your survival depends on inches and seconds, you'll try anything that gives you even a fractional advantage. And Crumb's ghost grease gave them more than a fraction. Modern naval historians and military strategists have analyzed Crumb's technique extensively, and what they've found is fascinating, because it reveals 3 overlapping principles that combined to create unexpected effectiveness. First, perceptual disruption. Human visual processing relies heavily on pattern recognition. We see edges, shapes, familiar silhouettes, and our brains instantly categorize them. That's how U-boat commanders could identify ship types at a glance. But Crumb's distortion broke that recognition pathway. The shimmering, melting effect made edges uncertain, created visual noise, forced the observer's brain to work harder to extract meaning from the image. And when you're looking through a periscope at night through salt spray and fog with your submarine vulnerable and escorts potentially closing in, that extra cognitive load matters enormously. Second, targeting degradation. Torpedo fire control wasn't just point and shoot. It required calculations based on target parameters, length, bearing, speed, distance. U-boat crews trained extensively on recognizing standard Allied ship profiles. They knew instinctively that a certain silhouette meant a Liberty ship, which meant specific dimensions, which meant specific torpedo settings. But if the silhouette appeared warped, if the lengths seemed ambiguous, if the speed was difficult to judge because the edges kept seeming to shift, bad input equals bad output. A torpedo fired on uncertain data was a torpedo likely wasted. This might be the most powerful factor. U-boat warfare was fundamentally about calculated risk. Commanders had to balance aggression with survival. Every attack decision carried weight. When presented with something that looked wrong, that triggered their intuition that something was off, many commanders chose the conservative option. Maybe it's a decoy. Maybe it's a trap. Maybe those shimmering edges are actually camouflaged escort destroyers waiting to pounce. Better to wait for a clearer target than gamble on something that feels uncertain. Crumb's innovation weaponized doubt. And unlike active measures like sonar jamming or radar countermeasures, this was completely passive. It didn't broadcast anything, didn't require power, didn't alert the enemy that countermeasures were in use. It was visual judo, using the observer's own perception against them. Field reports compiled in early 1943, though fragmentary and never officially published, showed something remarkable. Ships employing visual distortion techniques experienced a 17% reduction in successful torpedo hits compared to standard convoy vessels. 17% might not sound like much, but in total war where margins determine survival, where every ship that reaches port means supplies for a starving nation, 17% meant thousands of lives saved, hundreds of thousands of tons of critical materials delivered. The difference between Britain holding on and Britain collapsing when the war finally ended. When the Atlantic became safe again and merchant crews could sail without fear of periscopes in the darkness, James Crumb quietly returned to Yorkshire. No medals, no ceremonies, no speeches praising his innovation. He went back to cooking, found work in a pub kitchen, lived a simple, unremarkable civilian life. For decades, his contribution remained buried in classified military appendices, technical reports marked restricted, and filed away in archives that few researchers ever accessed. The official naval history of the Battle of the Atlantic barely mentioned passive optical countermeasures. When it did, the credit was typically attributed to field innovations by convoy crews, with no specific names attached. It wasn't until 1981, 36 years after the war ended, that a naval historian named Dr. Patricia Alderman stumbled across something curious while researching convoy survival tactics, buried in declassified documents. A repeated reference to optical deflection tactics developed in merchant vessels. Cross-referencing led her to maintenance logs from the SS Empire Belle, which led her to interview records, which led her eventually to James Crumb. He was in his 60s then, still living in Yorkshire, still working in kitchens. The BBC conducted an interview. Crumb was uncomfortable with the attention, kept deflecting credit. "I just saw a shimmer," he said, almost embarrassed. "Thought maybe Jerry would see it too. Wasn't anything clever, just noticing things." But what he'd actually done, what he'd invented in a cramped galley while enemy submarines hunted just beneath the hull, was profound. He pioneered passive signature reduction, a concept that would eventually evolve into stealth aircraft design, naval countermeasures, and modern electronic warfare tactics. The idea that hiding doesn't always mean disappearance, that sometimes the best camouflage is confusion, that deception can be more powerful than armor. Today, military strategists study Crumb's technique as an early example of cognitive warfare, using the enemy's own perception and decision-making processes against them. And in a strange way, it's almost poetic. The cook who spent his life making food disappear from plates discovered how to make ships disappear from periscopes. What makes James Crumb's story truly remarkable isn't just the innovation itself, it's where the innovation came from. Not from a laboratory filled with scientists, not from a war college strategy session, not from some admiral with decades of naval experience, from a man who chopped onions, who scrubbed pots, who worked the lowest rank in the lowest section of a merchant ship, a man whose qualifications were: he once moved stage lights in a small theater, and he paid attention to how moonlight hit grease stains. War is usually told through the lens of great men, generals making bold decisions, political leaders forging alliances, inventors in research facilities developing superweapons. But sometimes, maybe more often than we realize, history pivots because someone in the depths of the machine, someone without power or prestige or formal expertise, simply sees things differently. And here's the wonderful, terrible, beautiful truth about warfare. Crumb's idea wasn't even the weirdest innovation to emerge from World War II. In 1944, British intelligence painted actual cows to mimic roads from aerial reconnaissance, confusing Luftwaffe bomber navigators who were trying to match ground features to maps. Operation Bertram created an entire fake harbour out of mirrors, canvas, and plywood, making Rommel's forces in North Africa believe an invasion would come from the wrong direction entirely. One American unit in Sicily used bagpipes played through echo chambers to simulate the sound of armor divisions, fooling German observers into thinking Allied forces were far larger than reality. The British built an entire fake army complete with inflatable tanks and dummy aircraft, commanding it with General Patton specifically because German intelligence expected him to lead the D-Day invasion. War breeds strange genius, desperate innovation, the kind of ideas that would be dismissed as ridiculous in peacetime, but in the crucible of survival suddenly become viable. Crumb's ghost grease belongs in the Hall of Glorious Absurdity. Lard and tinfoil defeating sonar operators and torpedo guidance systems. A cook's intuition outsmarting naval engineering. And it worked. So next time someone mentions radar and sonar, precision-guided weapons and satellite surveillance, remember this: sometimes the most sophisticated enemy systems can be defeated by the simplest means. Sometimes the answer isn't more technology, it's different thinking. Sometimes it's lard, tinfoil, and a pair of eyes that see patterns where others see only shadows. James Crott never received his medal, never got his moment of public recognition. History almost forgot him entirely. But his idea survived, evolved, became part of how we think about concealment and deception in modern warfare. The ghost grease is gone, but the principle remains. And somewhere in classified military research facilities, engineers developing the next generation of stealth technology, whether they know it or not, are walking in the footsteps of a Yorkshire cook who just wanted to help his convoy survive another night. Should James Crumb have gotten a medal? Absolutely. Will history finally give him the recognition he deserves? Maybe. Slowly, as more people hear this story. But here's what matters most. He saved lives. Hundreds, maybe thousands of sailors who sailed through U-boat waters and reached port safely because one man noticed a shimmer and dared to think differently. That's not just innovation, that's heroism. The quiet kind. The kind that never asks for parades or monuments. The kind that simply does what needs doing and then goes back to cooking. If you found this story as remarkable as we did, if it made you rethink what heroism looks like, hit that like button and subscribe, because history's deepest treasures aren't found in textbooks or monuments. They're buried in declassified documents, hidden in maintenance logs, waiting in the memories of men and women who did extraordinary things and never thought to mention it. Next time, we're diving into one of the most successful spy networks in Europe. And yes, it involves pigeons. Hundreds of them. And the story is even stranger than this one. Stay curious. Keep questioning. And remember, the most powerful weapon in any war isn't always the biggest gun. Sometimes it's the person who sees what everyone else is missing. Until next time.